War in Imperial China was not silk robes and painted scrolls. It was iron meeting bone, fire ripping through shields, and blades heavy enough to end dynasties in a single swing. Every weapon was more than steel. It was an answer to fear, a gift from the ancestors, and a promise of survival. Today, we uncover 5 brutal weapons that turned soldiers into legends and enemies into dust. At first, we have the Ji, the halberd of death. This was the weapon that shattered cavalry charges, a hybrid of spear and axe that turned the battlefield into a slaughter ground. Imagine a wooden shaft as tall as a man, crowned with a spear point sharp enough to punch through armor, but with a hooked blade jutting from the side like a predator's claw. It didn't just pierce, it tore. In the spring and autumn period, armies marched not with swords raised, but behind forests of Ji. Thousands of points bristled forward, waiting for men and horses to slam into them. One thrust could split a chest wide open. One hook could yank a rider from his saddle, dragging him down into the mud where boots and blades finished what the Ji had started. This was not elegant swordplay, nor the duel of heroes sung in poetry. It was methodical, systematic killing, a wall of steel advancing step by step. The genius of the Ji was that it gave common soldiers the power to topple nobles. A peasant farmer, levied into war with no noble training, could unseat an armored cavalryman who thought himself untouchable. That was its brutal democracy. Wealth and armor meant nothing if the hook caught your ribs. The blood of emperors and the blood of farmers spilled the same way under its edge. Archaeologists still uncover Jis buried in Han Dynasty tombs. Their iron fused with rust, but their shapes unmistakable. Some carry inscriptions invoking courage from the ancestors. Warriors believed they did not wield the weapon alone. Behind each thrust were generations of forefathers gripping that same shaft, guiding the strike. To face a Ji was to face not just one soldier, but the weight of an entire lineage demanding survival. The Ji was never a weapon of beauty. It was function distilled into violence, a can opener for flesh and armor alike. It broke men as efficiently as possible, leaving behind piles of bodies and silence. Brutality given shape, the Ji was the blade that carved the foundations of empire. If the Ji was the hook that dragged men from their saddles, the Dao was the blade that ended them. Known simply as the knife, it became the most feared sword of Imperial China. Unlike the elegant Jian, celebrated in poetry and carried by scholars, the Dao had no illusions of refinement. It was forged for survival, for killing swiftly, for chopping through whatever stood in its way. Its single-edged curve carried weight toward the front, turning even an untrained swing into a cleaving strike. A recruit shaking with fear on his first battlefield could still drive the Dao into an enemy's ribs or neck and feel it bite deep. It gave soldiers confidence where none existed, and it gave generals a weapon that multiplied force through simplicity. During the Tang dynasty, monstrous two-handed versions called Changdao appeared, literally horse-cutting sabers. One downward stroke could shear through the legs of a warhorse, sending both beast and rider crashing to the earth. Imagine the terror of a cavalryman, proud in his armor, watching his mount collapse beneath him in shrieks of agony, all from one arc of steel. But the Dao was not confined to war. It was also the empire's blade of judgment. Executioners favored heavy Daos for public beheadings. The whistle of steel through air, the thud of a head into straw, and the gasps of onlookers turned the weapon into a warning. The emperor's justice was final, and the Dao delivered it. Before battle, warriors placed incense in ancestral halls, bowing to forefathers and asking for steady hands. To carry a Dao was to carry more than iron. It was to carry the memory of men who had swung it before, victories won not by elegant duels, but by relentless chopping until the enemy broke. The Dao was never refined. It was raw violence given form, an executioner's promise hammered into steel. On the battlefield or in the square, it spoke one truth. Life could end in a single stroke, and the Dao would never hesitate. If the Dao was brutal efficiency, the Changdao was its monstrous evolution. This was no ordinary saber. It stretched nearly 6 feet in length, a weapon so enormous that to wield it meant sacrificing comfort, stamina, and sometimes even sanity. It was not built for balance or elegance. It was built to erase. When the Changdao struck, it did not just kill. It cleared space, ended bloodlines, and carved terror into every soldier who saw it coming. During the Tang dynasty, elite guards were armed with these massive two-handed sabers. Their training was relentless. They swung until their shoulders burned raw, until their hands blistered and split. A Changdao demanded devotion before it would yield mastery. Against spearmen, the blade sliced through pike shafts like brittle reeds. Against cavalry, its length gave reach enough to hack at horses' necks and legs, cutting down both mount and rider before the enemy's steel could land. Centuries later, Ming generals revived the weapon to fight Japanese pirates along the coasts. The Wokou had humiliated local militias with their fast and disciplined swordsmanship. The empire's answer was not finesse, but overwhelming steel. The Changdao's sheer size gave Chinese infantry a brutal advantage, turning sword duels into massacres. Accounts describe soldiers drilling in formation, entire ranks swinging downward in unison. The sound was like iron gates slamming shut. Anyone standing before them faced not men, but a moving wall of guillotines. Few survived the first stroke, fewer still the second. Fragments of Changdao blades have been unearthed in Ming frontier graves. They were buried with warriors who spent their lives learning to endure the weapon's punishing weight. For these men, it was more than iron. It was a scythe of duty, a reaper's blade passed down by ancestors who demanded survival. Families burned offerings before battle, praying their sons' arms would not falter mid-swing. The Changdao was never forgiving. It drained strength, punished hesitation, and demanded absolute devotion. But it became the empire's sharpest answer to chaos, a reminder that sometimes survival required a blade longer than reason itself. Among the most terrifying inventions of Imperial China was not forged only of steel, but of fire itself. The fire lance was the ancestor of every gun that followed, the moment when warfare shifted forever from muscle to chemistry. At first glance, it looked like a spear, but its tip held not just a blade. It carried a tube packed with gunpowder. When lit, it did not simply pierce, it roared. The weapon spat flame, sparks, and smoke, breathing like a dragon into the enemy's face. Imagine standing in formation, shield raised, when suddenly the man before you thrusts forward, not a spear, but a burst of fire. Your shield melts, your vision sears white, and the line around you breaks before steel even has the chance to strike. By the 12th century, Chinese soldiers had refined this terror further. They loaded the tubes with shards of porcelain, iron scraps, and needles. When ignited, the fire lance erupted in a storm of hot shrapnel, a primitive shotgun that shredded armor and tore flesh from bone in seconds. The Song dynasty used it desperately against the Jurchen and Mongols, enemies whose cavalry swept across China with relentless force. Spears and walls often crumbled, but fire and thunder could drive even seasoned warriors back. Chronicles describe horses bolting in terror as flames erupted from ranks they had thought defenseless. For the first time in history, fire itself had been turned into a soldier's weapon. But the fire lance was more than innovation, it was spirit. To many warriors, it seemed the old gods of thunder and flame had lent their fury to mortal hands. Soldiers offered incense before battle, asking their ancestors to steady their grip on a weapon as unpredictable as it was powerful. Misfires were common, barrels burst in men's hands, yet still they carried them forward, believing they were wielding heaven's fire and that their sacrifice kept the empire alive. The fire lance did not last long, soon replaced by true firearms, but its birth marked a turning point. It was the first breath of gunpowder on the battlefield, the moment when the age of steel gave way to the age of fire, and nothing in war would ever be the same again. At last, we have the Guandao. If there was ever a weapon that carried the very spirit of Imperial China, it was this. The Guandao was not just steel on a shaft, it was the embodiment of loyalty, strength, and fear, a weapon as symbolic as it was lethal. A massive polearm topped with a wide crescent blade, it resembled less a tool of war and more a moving executioner's block. To see it raised on a battlefield was to know that someone's fate had already been decided. The Guandao is inseparable from one man. Guan Yu, the great general of the late Han dynasty, who became so revered he was later deified as the god of war. Legends say his personal weapon, the green dragon crescent blade, weighed over 40 pounds. Whether or not that's true hardly matters. What mattered was what it represented: ferocity, justice, and loyalty, so unwavering that generations came to believe heaven itself guided the man who carried it. Facing a Guandao was not simply facing an opponent. It was like fighting the will of the ancestors, condensed into steel. On the battlefield, the Guandao was terror made tangible. Its long reach allowed soldiers to sweep through infantry, arcs of steel cutting multiple men down in a single swing. The blade's sheer weight meant armor cracked, bones split, and shields shattered. Cavalry were not spared. That hooked edge could drag a rider from his horse, leaving him broken and helpless before the inevitable finishing blow. To stand before it was to stand before a guillotine. Except this guillotine moved where its master commanded. Generals often carried the Guandao not only as a weapon, but as a symbol of power. Its size, its weight, and its myth gave presence to those who bore it. Even centuries later, martial artists trained with the weapon, believing mastery of the Guandao was a test of both physical and spiritual strength. It demanded endurance, precision, and discipline. In shrines across China, replicas of Guan Yu's green dragon crescent blade are still offered incense. People bow before them as though the ancestors themselves remain at its edge, demanding respect. The Guandao was not merely a polearm, it was faith forged into steel, a crescent blade that carved not only victory, but legend into the heart of China. Now these weapons weren't just forged for killing. They carried the weight of ancestors, the roar of empires, and the promise that survival demanded brutality. From the Ji that hooked riders down to the Guandao that cut through horse and man alike, each one carved history in iron and blood. If you felt the power of these stories, subscribe now and join us, because the next battle we uncover will cut even deeper.